I was grading midterm exams in the faculty lounge when Principal Henderson burst through the door without knocking. The smell of stale coffee and white board markers filled the air, mixing with the lingering scent of the tuna sandwich someone had microwaved earlier. The fluorescent light above flickered intermittently, casting shadows across my stack of geometry tests as I looked up from my work, red pen still bleeding corrections onto a student's attempt at proving the Pythagorean theorem. "Sarah, we need to talk now." The urgency in his voice made my stomach clench. After 23 years teaching high school mathematics at Riverside High, I thought I'd seen every type of administrative crisis. Budget cuts that eliminated our graphing calculator program. Parent complaints about grades their children had rightfully earned. State testing drama that kept us all working weekends to prepare students for assessments that measured nothing meaningful. But the look on Henderson's face told me this was different. This was personal. His jaw was clenched tight, his usually perfect tie askew, and there was something in his eyes I'd never seen before, something that looked almost like satisfaction. He slammed a thick manila folder onto the scratched wooden table where I was working, sending my carefully organized test papers scattering across the surface like autumn leaves in a windstorm. The sound echoed through the empty lounge like a gunshot, reverberating off the cinder block walls painted that institutional shade of beige that screamed public education budget. "Care to explain this?" he demanded, pointing at what looked like financial documents spilling from the folder. I stared at the papers, my mind racing to understand what I was looking at. Spreadsheets, purchase orders, budget allocations, numbers that should have made sense to me, but in that moment felt like hieroglyphics carved in stone. I had no idea that in the next 5 minutes my entire career would be destroyed by 4 simple words. Words that would echo in my head during sleepless nights for months to come. Words that would ultimately become the biggest mistake Principal Henderson ever made in his 20-year administrative career. Let me back up and paint you the full picture. I'm Sarah Mitchell, and I've been teaching mathematics at Riverside High School since September of 2001. My first day, I was 24 years old with a fresh master's degree in mathematics education and dreams of inspiring the next generation of problem solvers. Algebra 2, geometry, pre-calculus, and eventually advanced placement calculus. I've shepherded thousands of students through the mysteries of quadratic equations and trigonometric functions, watching their faces light up when abstract concepts finally clicked into place. Riverside High is what education reformers politely call a challenging school. We serve a diverse community of 3,000 students, where 60% qualify for free lunch, and many are the first in their families to graduate high school, let alone consider college. Our building is a sprawling brick structure from the 1970s, with hallways that echo every footstep and classrooms where the heating system makes mysterious clanking sounds during winter months. Despite the obstacles, outdated textbooks held together with duct tape, a roof that leaked into my classroom every time it rained, and a student body that arrived each morning carrying the weight of family struggles and economic hardship, our math department had something to be proud of. 3 months before this confrontation, I'd received news that should have been career-defining. My advanced placement calculus students had achieved the highest pass rate in the entire district, 87%. The state average was 54%. The national average was 59%. When the results came in that July afternoon, I'd actually cried tears of joy in my empty classroom, surrounded by the posters of famous mathematicians that had watched over years of lessons. I'd framed the official letter from the college board, printed on their prestigious letterhead, and hung it in my classroom right next to the faded poster of Einstein that had been there since my first year. Below it, I'd posted the individual score reports, names redacted for privacy, showing the 4s and 5s my students had earned. Kids who'd been told they weren't college material had passed a test that would earn them college credit at top universities across the country. The school newsletter had buried the achievement in a tiny paragraph on page 3, sandwiched between the announcement about new parking regulations and a reminder about the dress code policy. No recognition assembly, no congratulations from administration. No mention in the morning announcements, just business as usual at Riverside High, where academic excellence was apparently less newsworthy than the cafeteria's switch to whole grain pizza crust. But I didn't complain. I never did. I loved teaching with a passion that had only grown stronger over the years, and seeing my students succeed was reward enough. Or so I told myself during those quiet moments when disappointment threatened to creep in. The truth was, I'd been systematically overlooked for years, like a piece of furniture that administrators had grown so accustomed to, they'd stopped seeing it entirely. While other teachers got spotlights in the newsletter for organizing bake sales or coaching sports teams that won participation trophies, my academic achievements went unnoticed. When the school needed someone to stay late to tutor struggling students, they called me. When they needed someone to cover an extra class because of budget cuts, they assigned me without asking. When they needed accurate grade calculations for state reports, they relied on my color-coded spreadsheets that had never contained a single error. I'd become the invisible workhorse of Riverside High, the reliable Sarah who never caused trouble, never demanded recognition, never rocked the boat that so many others seemed determined to capsize. The pattern had become predictable. Every August, I'd submit detailed lesson plans for the upcoming year, complete with pacing guides and assessment schedules. Every November, I'd provide data showing my students' growth from the beginning of the year. Every March, I'd present evidence of my class's success on state standardized tests. And every June, I'd watch as the recognition went to teachers whose main achievement was showing up consistently. Last spring, I'd applied for the mathematics department head position when Mrs. Rodriguez retired after 30 years of service. I had the most experience, the highest student test scores, and I'd been the unofficial mentor to every new math teacher for the past decade. When Kevin Morris, a fresh-faced graduate from the local university, had questions about classroom management, he came to me. When Jennifer Williams needed help understanding the district's grading policies, she knocked on my door. When the state auditors needed documentation of our curriculum alignment, they requested my files. The position went to Kevin Morris, a second-year teacher, whose main qualification seemed to be his ability to make small talk with administrators in the hallway and his willingness to volunteer for committees that met during lunch periods. His classroom management was mediocre at best. His lesson plans were generic templates downloaded from the internet, and his students' test scores were consistently below the district average. When they announced his promotion during a faculty meeting in May, Principal Henderson had pulled me aside afterward, with what I now recognize as patronizing sympathy dripping from his voice like honey from a broken jar. "Sarah, you're such a valuable teacher. We need you in the classroom, not stuck in meetings all day dealing with administrative nonsense. Kevin will handle all that bureaucratic stuff while you focus on what you do best, teaching kids." I'd smiled and nodded, swallowing the disappointment like a bitter pill. But inside, something had started to crack. A foundation of trust and respect that had taken 23 years to build was developing fault lines that would soon become impossible to ignore. Back to that afternoon in the faculty lounge, where the smell of burnt coffee and the flickering fluorescent light created an atmosphere that felt more like an interrogation room than a place where educators gathered to collaborate and support each other. Henderson was standing over me with those financial documents, his shadow falling across my scattered test papers like a storm cloud blocking the sun. His face was red with anger, and I could see a vein pulsing in his temple. "The district audit found significant discrepancies in our budget reports," he said, his voice rising with each word. "Specifically in the mathematics department allocations that you've been responsible for tracking." I looked down at the papers he'd scattered across my tests, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Numbers, spreadsheets, purchase orders with my signature, budget allocations with my handwritten notes in the margins. My chest tightened as I recognized my own careful documentation, the same meticulous record-keeping that had made me the go-to person for financial accuracy. "I don't understand," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the tremor I could feel creeping in. "I submitted all the required documentation for our textbook purchases and technology upgrades. Everything was double-checked and verified." "Documentation that doesn't add up," Henderson snapped, jabbing his finger at a particular spreadsheet. "The calculator order alone is off by $3,000. The geometry textbook purchase shows a discrepancy of $1,500. The smartboard installation costs don't match the invoices. How do you explain that?" I leaned forward, studying the spreadsheet more carefully. My eyes scanned the columns of numbers, looking for the errors he was describing. The figures were swimming slightly. I was tired. It had been a long day of teaching 6 classes back to back, dealing with a parent conference about a student who was failing because he refused to do homework, and staying after school to help 3 seniors with college application essays. "Let me look at this more carefully," I said, reaching for my reading glasses that hung on a chain around my neck. "These numbers don't match what I submitted. There might be—" "You don't need glasses to see that you can't do basic arithmetic," Henderson interrupted, his voice carrying across the room with the volume of a man who'd grown accustomed to being obeyed without question. "For God's sake, Sarah, you're supposedly a math teacher, and you can't even add simple numbers together correctly." The words hit me like a physical blow, as if he'd reached across the table and slapped me across the face. My hands trembled as I set down my red pen, the same pen I'd been using to correct student work for over 2 decades. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to buzz louder, and I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, pounding like a drum in a marching band. Mrs. Patterson from the English department had been grading papers in the corner, her usual spot by the window, where she could watch the parking lot for her husband's pickup truck. She looked up from her stack of essays, her face a mask of shock and embarrassment, not for Henderson's unprofessional behavior, but for me, for the humiliation I was enduring. Our eyes met for just a moment before she quickly looked away, focusing intently on her papers, as if the secrets of the universe were hidden in a sophomore's analysis of Romeo and Juliet. "You can't even add." 4 words that reduced 23 years of dedication to nothing. 4 words that question not just my professional competence, but my very identity as an educator. 4 words that implied I was a fraud, a pretender, someone who had been fooling everyone, including myself, for more than 2 decades. I stared at the spreadsheet, feeling heat flush my cheeks as if I was standing too close to a furnace. My vision blurred, and for a moment I couldn't focus on the numbers at all. They seemed to dance and shift on the page, mocking me with their apparent complexity. That night, I sat in my kitchen staring at my laptop screen, surrounded by the quiet comfort of my own home. The familiar sounds of the neighborhood, dogs barking, teenagers laughing as they walked by, the distant hum of traffic on the main road, provided a stark contrast to the chaos in my mind. I'd brought the disputed documents home in a manila envelope, spreading them across my dining table under the warm glow of my banker's lamp. The smell of chamomile tea did nothing to calm my racing thoughts as I traced through every line item, every calculation, every budget allocation, with the precision of a detective examining evidence at a crime scene. The humiliation of the afternoon replayed in my mind like a broken record. "You can't even add." The words had followed me home, echoing in the silence of my empty house. I'd always been proud of my mathematical precision. My grade books were immaculate, organized by student ID number and color-coded by assignment type. My lesson plans were calculated to the minute, with built-in time for questions and review. My students' test scores spoke for themselves. 23 years of consistently high performance, that had earned me respect from colleagues and gratitude from parents. But now, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold beside me, I felt like a fraud. Maybe Henderson was right. Maybe I'd been making errors all along, errors that everyone had been too polite to point out. Maybe my students' success had been despite my teaching, not because of it. And then I found it. Hidden in the district's purchasing system, buried in a subsection of the budget allocation spreadsheet that required cross-referencing 3 different documents, was the source of the discrepancy. The $3,000 error in the calculator order wasn't an error at all. It was a duplicate entry. The same purchase order had been logged twice by the district's purchasing department, once in September and again in October. My documentation was correct. My math was correct. My careful record-keeping had been accurate down to the penny. I felt a surge of anger so intense it surprised me, burning through my chest like wildfire. 23 years of being the good soldier, the reliable team player, the teacher who never complained or demanded special treatment. 23 years of staying late, working weekends, spending my own money on classroom supplies when the budget ran short. 23 years of putting students first, administration second, and myself last. And for what? To be publicly humiliated for someone else's incompetence? To have my professional integrity questioned because a district clerk had made a data entry error? I closed my laptop with more force than necessary and made a decision that would change the trajectory of my career forever. I wasn't going to let this go. Not this time. The next morning, I arrived at school an hour early, when the hallways were still empty except for the custodial staff finishing their overnight cleaning routine. Their cartwheels squeaked against the polished linoleum floors as they moved from classroom to classroom, leaving behind the scent of industrial disinfectant and the satisfaction of a job well done. I walked to the main office with purpose, my corrected documentation carefully organized in a manila folder under my arm. The morning light streaming through the tall windows cast long shadows across the trophy case, displaying decades of academic and athletic achievements. I need to speak with Principal Henderson, I told Mrs. Garcia, the secretary who'd been the heart of Riverside High's administrative office for nearly as long as I'd been teaching there. He's not in yet, honey. Is everything okay? I'd known Mrs. Garcia since my first year, when she'd helped me navigate the maze of paperwork required for a new teacher. She'd celebrated with me when I'd gotten tenure, commiserated with me during difficult parent conferences, and always remembered to ask about my mother's health during her cancer treatments. The genuine concern in her voice was like a balm to my wounded pride. "I'm fine," I said, though we both knew that wasn't entirely true. "I'll wait." While I sat in the plastic chair outside Henderson's office, I noticed something I'd never paid attention to before. The bulletin board behind Mrs. Garcia's desk was covered with budget summaries, expenditure reports, and financial documents, all public information that anyone could request to see under the state's Freedom of Information Act. As I waited, my eyes scanned the posted documents with the trained precision of someone who'd spent decades working with numbers. What I saw made my blood run cold. The budget discrepancies weren't isolated to the mathematics department. They were everywhere. Science department orders that didn't match deliveries, English department textbook purchases that exceeded approved allocations, technology upgrades that were paid for but never installed. An idea began to form in my mind, growing like a seed planted in fertile soil. Over the next 2 weeks, I did something I'd never done in my 23-year career. I started asking questions. I submitted formal requests for budget documentation under the state's public records law. I attended school board meetings for the first time since my initial job interview. I studied the district's financial procedures with the same intensity I had once reserved for preparing students for calculus competitions. What I discovered was a pattern of financial mismanagement that went far beyond simple clerical errors. Purchase orders submitted without proper authorization, invoices paid without verification of delivery, Budget allocations that shifted like sand dunes in a desert storm, with no clear accountability or oversight. I created a comprehensive spreadsheet tracking every discrepancy I found, cross-referencing purchase orders with delivery receipts, comparing budget allocations with actual expenditures, and documenting a trail of financial chaos that would make a forensic accountant weep with frustration. The deeper I dug, the more convinced I became that Principal Henderson's attack on my competence was nothing more than a desperate attempt to deflect attention from the district's own systemic failures. The opportunity for vindication came during our monthly faculty meeting in late October. The leaves outside the library windows had turned brilliant shades of orange and red, creating a backdrop that seemed almost too beautiful for what was about to unfold. Principal Henderson stood at the front of the room beside the smart board, his PowerPoint presentation projected in crisp detail. 27 teachers sat in the uncomfortable plastic chairs that had been arranged in neat rows, most of them grading papers or checking email on their phones while Henderson droned through his standard administrative updates. "As you can see," he said, clicking to a slide titled Efficient Resource Management, "our fiscal management has maintained excellent standards this year. We've stayed within budget in all major categories while continuing to provide our students with the resources they need for success." The irony of his words wasn't lost on me. I sat in the back row, my comprehensive documentation organized in a thick binder on my lap, waiting for the right moment to strike. "I have a question about the mathematics department budget discrepancies from last month," I said, raising my hand with the confidence of someone who'd spent weeks preparing for this moment. The room went quiet. 27 teachers turned to look at me, then at Henderson, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Mrs. Patterson, who'd witnessed my humiliation in the faculty lounge, shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her grading pen frozen halfway to a paper. Henderson's face flushed red, and I could see his jaw clench. "I believe we resolved that issue, Sarah. There's no need to rehash." "Actually, we didn't resolve anything," I interrupted, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "The error was in the district's purchasing system, not in my calculations. I have the corrected reports here, along with documentation showing similar discrepancies throughout the entire district budget." I stood up, my binder of evidence in hand, feeling the weight of 23 years of quiet professionalism giving way to something more powerful, the righteous anger of someone who'd been wronged and had the proof to set the record straight. "When is the appropriate time to discuss financial accuracy?" I asked, looking directly at Henderson. "When you publicly question my competence in front of my colleagues? When you told a 23-year veteran mathematics teacher that she can't even add? When you humiliated me for errors that weren't mine?" The silence in the room was deafening. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning system, the distant sound of students at after-school activities, the tick of the wall clock marking seconds that felt like hours. "Furthermore," I continued, opening my binder to reveal pages of meticulously organized documentation, "I've identified over 70 similar discrepancies in our district's budget reports. Duplicate entries, missing deliveries, phantom purchases, and unauthorized expenditures totaling nearly $200,000 in wasted resources over the past 2 fiscal years. Henderson's PowerPoint slide still glowed behind him, its title, Efficient Resource Management, now seeming like a cruel joke painted in 24-point font. Kevin Morris, the newly appointed department head who'd gotten the position I'd deserved, was staring at me with a mixture of admiration and terror. He knew, as we all did, that I'd just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. "I think the school board would be very interested in these findings," I said, my voice carrying across the silent library with the authority of someone who'd spent decades teaching students to think critically and question assumptions. "Don't you, Principal Henderson?" The school board meeting was held 3 weeks later in the district's main conference room, a wood-paneled space that smelled of old leather and nervous perspiration. The fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows across the faces of the 7 board members seated at the curved table that dominated the room. I sat in the front row of the public seating area, my comprehensive budget analysis printed and bound in a professional folder that had cost me $47 at the local copy shop. Behind me, I could hear the whispered conversations of other teachers who'd come to witness what everyone was calling Sarah's moment of truth. Principal Henderson sat across the room with the district's attorney, a thin man in an expensive suit who kept checking his watch as if he had somewhere more important to be. The irony wasn't lost on me. Henderson had hired legal representation to defend against the mathematical analysis of a teacher who supposedly couldn't even aid. When my turn came to speak, I walked to the podium with the confidence I'd discovered in the accuracy of numbers and the power of truth. For 45 minutes, I presented my findings with the precision of a calculus proof, each piece of evidence building upon the last to create an unassailable conclusion. Every discrepancy was documented with source materials. Every error was traced to its point of origin. Every dollar of waste was accounted for with the thoroughness of someone who'd spent her career teaching students that mathematics was about more than numbers. It was about logic, evidence, and the pursuit of truth. The board members asked detailed questions about my methodology, my sources, and my conclusions. I answered each one with the mathematical certainty that had defined my teaching career, referencing specific documents, citing exact figures, and providing context that revealed the scope of the district's financial mismanagement. Dr. Williams, the board president, leaned forward as I concluded my presentation. Miss Mitchell, in your professional opinion, what would it take to implement proper oversight of our budget processes? That's an excellent question, I replied, feeling the weight of 23 years of experience behind my words. The district needs someone with strong analytical skills, attention to detail, and the ability to identify patterns and discrepancies in complex financial data. Someone who understands the relationship between budget allocations and educational outcomes. Someone who can't be intimidated into silence when they discover problems that need to be addressed. 2 months later, the district announced a complete overhaul of their budget management system. They hired a new fiscal administrator and implemented comprehensive oversight procedures. They also announced the creation of a new position, District Budget Compliance Officer, reporting directly to the superintendent with authority to audit all financial procedures and expenditures. The job description was remarkably specific. Monitor all district spending, identify discrepancies in budget reports, ensure proper allocation of resources, and provide detailed analysis of financial efficiency. Required qualifications included advanced mathematical skills, demonstrated attention to detail, experience in educational finance, and a track record of identifying systemic problems. I was the only candidate who applied, and I was hired unanimously by the school board. Now, I manage a $50 million budget for our school district, overseeing the financial operations of 37 schools and 45,000 students. Every purchase order crosses my desk before approval. Every allocation requires my sign-off. Every expense is scrutinized with the mathematical precision that Principal Henderson once mocked in front of my colleagues. My office is in the district's administrative building, with windows that overlook the parking lot where I used to arrive each morning as a classroom teacher. I have a staff of 3 financial analysts who help me track expenditures and identify potential problems before they become crises. The walls are decorated with my college degrees, my teaching awards, and yes, that framed letter from the college board announcing my students' exceptional AP calculus scores. The irony isn't lost on me every single day. The woman who supposedly couldn't even add now oversees the financial operations that keep thousands of students in classrooms with qualified teachers, updated textbooks, and functioning technology. The teacher who was humiliated for someone else's errors now has the authority to prevent those errors from happening in the first place. Henderson transferred to another district 6 months after the board meeting. He never apologized, never acknowledged his mistake, never admitted that his attack on my competence was nothing more than a desperate attempt to cover up systemic failures. But every time I sign off on a major budget allocation, every time I identify a discrepancy that could have cost the district thousands of dollars, every time I ensure that resources reach the students who need them most, I think about that afternoon in the faculty lounge. If you're an educator reading this, I want you to know something that took me 23 years to learn. Your expertise matters. Your knowledge has value. Your experience counts for something. When someone questions your competence, especially when that questioning comes from a place of desperation rather than genuine concern, don't just accept it and move on. Ask questions, demand documentation, trust your skills and your instincts, document everything, keep records, pay attention to patterns that others might miss. The same analytical skills that make you effective in the classroom can be powerful tools for identifying problems and demanding solutions. And if you're in administration, please remember this: the teachers you dismiss, the colleagues you humiliate, the experts you ignore. They're the ones who really understand how the system works. They're the ones who can see the problems you miss because they're dealing with the consequences every single day. They're the ones who, when pushed too far, have the knowledge and the determination to change everything. Because sometimes the teacher who supposedly can't even aid is the only one who's been keeping accurate track of where all the money has been going. And sometimes that teacher has the skills, the evidence, and the resolve to make sure the truth finally adds up. The math always works out in the end. It just takes someone who knows how to do the calculations correctly.